So I'm going to give sort of a general overview, and Steve will talk about the stakeholder group, the Washington stakeholder group that's been working on forest carbon mitigation issues, both a 2008 version and a current version. And then we'll kind of, Steve has to leave to go to another appointment, but I'll be sticking around. We want to really give a lot of the time to Denise, who's going to be talking about her organization's experience in the trenches dealing with carbon offset marketing. So I think that will be really, really interesting. And then we can have questions for as long as you like. So I'm just going to repeat a little bit of what I talked to the group about back in June when I gave sort of a policy overview, but just to kind of ground this. So we're talking about climate mitigation here, and that people normally think of there's sort of two sides of climate efforts. One is mitigation, is how can we mitigate for the emissions of greenhouse gases and the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then climate change adaptation is how can we deal with the effects of climate change that's already happening or emerging by making human and natural systems more resilient. So we're talking about the mitigation side here today, that it's very related, particularly in forestry systems, with adaptation, as was sort of a theme of my earlier talk. So it's important to know a little bit about this, but we're not actually going to be talking much about adaptation in this discussion. So on the mitigation side, the overall goal of society is to reduce those atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases in two ways: by reducing the emissions of the anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, and hopefully then by increasing the carbon that's sequestered and stored in natural systems. So that's what everything you read in the paper about cap and trade or carbon sequestration or offsets or all of this stuff is aimed at these two goals. So the forest side of that then is what we're trying to do is reduce losses of forest cover. Okay, our nation's and world's forests, and particularly our state's forests, represent a huge sink of carbon that might otherwise be in the atmosphere contributing to climate change. And so maintaining that forest cover, maintaining that sink, and reducing losses is really critical. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions that occur from forests, such as with decomposition associated with harvest, for example, wildfires and decomposition associated with insect and disease outbreaks, all of those things at some spectrum between natural and human cause emit greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So controlling those is an aspect of this. Increasing, not just avoiding the loss, but increasing forest sequestration and storage is an important policy goal. And all of these have to be seen as not unilateral goals in themselves, but occurring in concert with other natural resource goals like protecting biodiversity, protecting water quality, promoting natural resource economy, and all of those other goals that are also critical to folks. I said that Washington's forests were really important. This is I think, getting to be a little bit dated data. I can't remember. I think it's 2005 or 2003 or something. But Washington State's gross annual emissions of greenhouse gases in this year, early 2000s, was 95 million tons of what the unit that's used in measurement is carbon dioxide equivalents. So not all greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide. There's some other gases that are actually more intense in their greenhouse gas effect, but the unit of measure is carbon dioxide equivalents. In that year, the estimated annual sequestration by biological systems, mostly forests in Washington State, was 30 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that brought the net emissions down to 65. So you can see that the actions of our forests in pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is a crucial part of this state's greenhouse gas picture. And therefore, avoiding reductions in that sequestering sink and perhaps promoting increases in that sequestration capacity are really important goals for Washington State. Forests play an absolutely crucial role in Washington in our overall approach to climate change mitigation.
Craig?
Yes?
Could you explain a little bit more about the gross annual emissions? I'm having trouble figuring out.
So all of the sources of energy production, industry, transportation, residential, everything that emits greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, 90 million. Okay? 30 million of that was reabsorbed that year by our forests primarily and other biological systems, leaving 65 million net.
Thank you.
You bet, Mary. Thanks for the question. So there are a variety of approaches to emission reductions, and you're familiar reading in the newspaper with both voluntary and regulatory approaches. So voluntary approaches are a city or a sports team or a rock star or you in your household or whomever says, I want to reduce my greenhouse gas footprint. And so I'm going to either cut back on something I'm doing now, or maybe I'm going to pay somebody else to do something that either reduces emissions or increases sequestration. And so you hear about Starbucks or somebody purchasing forest offsets to help reduce their carbon emissions. All of that is voluntary. Regulatory approaches, which we don't have any of yet in Washington, in our region, or nationally, would be a requirement by the government, particularly industry and energy production, but also transportation and buildings and residential, to cap their emissions at current levels and then gradually reduce those emissions to targeted levels by some future date. And there are various fairly aggressive goals to reduce emissions by say 70% of 2000 or 2005 levels by some period of decades into the future. I'm not going to give you the numbers. Washington State has legislation that establishes goals for Washington. However, there's no regulatory mechanism in Washington or nationally to enforce that. But if there were, that would leave people who are emitting greenhouse gases with the requirement to either reduce their greenhouse gases or pay somebody else who doesn't have a requirement or has already met theirs to either create further reductions or to sequester more carbon in natural systems like forests. So the voluntary systems that are out there right now, voluntary desires to reduce emissions, are to some degree creating a bit of a market for the sale of carbon offsets, which is an offset is I will take some action to increase carbon storage by planting trees or doing something like that, and I will sell that. I'll measure that, package it up, and sell that to you, and that offsets some of your emissions. Okay, so some of that is occurring. If there was a regulatory system, and the most commonly discussed kind of regulatory system is a cap and trade system where the regulated entities are capped, their emissions are capped and then lowered, but the regulated entities are allowed to trade emission credits among themselves so that those who can most economically reduce end up doing most of the reduction. Those who can least economically reduce do what they can and then buy credits from others so that the overall system reduces emissions in the most economically efficient way. That's the logic of a cap and trade system. It's administratively very complex, and that's the downside of it. But if there were a regulatory system like cap and trade, forest sequestration projects that increase the amount of carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere could become offsets in a market, okay? And that could be a fairly major and robust market. There is a market in Europe where they do have a regulatory system, and people are in the business of selling forestry offset credits in Europe. There's not much of a market yet in the U.S., but Denise is going to give you a very good look-see into the market that does exist right now. Anna, you had a question?
Vehicle emissions and the regulatory that we don't have?
Yes. Yes. So, in a cap and trade system, there's some important policy considerations. I'm not going to talk a lot about these, but the first one is forestry in or out of the cap? Because, as I said, there are emissions going on from forest management activities, some of which are human origin, and then there's emissions associated with loss of forests, like conversion to other land uses. There are those that argue that those should be part of the cap. None of the cap and trade systems that we've seen proposed extends the cap to forestry activities, though, and therefore, from outside the cap, forestry is in the position of creating offsets and selling them into the capped system to those entities that have a regulatory obligation to reduce their emissions. So there's a question about whether the degree to which regulated entities would be able to satisfy their obligation by just buying offsets rather than actually reducing their emissions. Some people feel like it would be more economically efficient to maximize the ability for offsets to meet the goals, and other people feel like if the real goal is forcing technological change to actually reduce emissions, keeping that pressure off by letting regulated entities simply buy offsets delays that technological forcing. So there is a pretty healthy debate about the role of offsets in a regulatory system. If, to the extent that offsets are included, they have to walk and quack just like a actual emission reduction. And most of the controversy around offsets is that, well, you know, it's something that somebody was going to do anyway, and so from an atmospheric standpoint, you really haven't gotten the gain of a real emission reduction. You've gotten some, bogus feel-good activities. And so in a regulated system, there really has to be assurance that the offset is just like an emission, so that it has to be additional above what would happen otherwise. It has to be, to a great degree, permanent. It has to avoid leakage. In other words, if I reduce emissions or increase sequestration over here, the market isn't just going to make the same, an offsetting thing happen over here and eliminate that effect. And it has to be measurable and verifiable so people can take it to market and have something that the buyer can count on. Offsets could include improved forest sequestration and storage in the forest. They could include improved storage in forest products that are long-lived and out there in the market. They could include avoiding conversion, land use conversion, and they can include reforesting areas that have been forested in the past but haven't been recently. And as I said, all of these are subject to folks' desire to pursue other forestry goals like biodiversity, economic development, et cetera, et cetera. Overall, though, what we're trying to do is avoid the biggest threat to climate change from a forestry standpoint is loss of the sink. And so land use conversion is one of the biggest things that we're trying to address. And the other potential loss of the sink is through climate change effects on insects and disease and fire. And because if the trees in the forest are dying and burning up, then they're not serving that sink function anymore. And this can be serious enough and real enough to the extent that, for example, north of the border in British Columbia, the government of British Columbia has come to the painful conclusion that their forests are no longer a sink. They have been so decimated by insects and disease, and most of us have seen pictures of the red dying forests in British Columbia, that British Columbia's forests now are felt to be a source of carbon emissions rather than a sink pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. That's a pretty big deal. That's pretty serious. And in Washington, we're trying to avoid that happening here. It's not to that point yet in Washington, but that's an important goal to be avoided. Right?
That's eastern.
That would be, well, that would, yes, but BC as a whole is dominated by those interior effects. So that finding about source rather than sink is in aggregate. Yeah, pretty big deal. So in summary, I think particularly with regard to those forest health and fire reduction effects, what we can do in climate mitigation can also help promote the forest management actions that confer adaptive resilience in the face of climate change itself. So there, as I said in my earlier discussion, there is a lot of interaction between management to store more carbon or to keep forests from dying or burning up, and the actions that will help forests stay healthy in the face of continuing climate change that is occurring and emerging now. So that's sort of the overview. I'll be around for questions later. Stephen is going to talk about what the multi-stakeholder work group has been doing to develop an offset program for Washington forestry.
Thank you, Craig.
I'm going to literally whip through that and skip over some slides, but what I want to talk to you about is what the Forest Sector Climate Group has been doing. We initially were organized as a result of House Bill 2815 in 2008, and we were basically asked to develop recommendations around what an offset or credit type program, whether it was voluntary or regulatory, in a multi-sector based system. And the one thing that you need to keep in mind is because Washington is so special, as far as the bar in which forestry is conducted here, one of the concerns the legislature and others has had, forest landowners, is that we don't do something that has unintended consequences. We have a fairly high level bar here, so business as usual is different than, say, in Oregon, Montana, etc. So figuring out how we can be part of this market as it emerges and still be able to gain some benefit from it is the challenge that we're faced with. We also, last year, the governor had an executive order out on climate, and after 2008 work group activities, we were asked to continue that work, specifically focused on protocol development, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then this last legislative session, the work that we're doing right now is going to slowly make a connection to an incentives bill that was passed by the legislature in this last session, because many of the things that we're going to be doing in regards or suggesting in the Forest Climate Group can also be considered an incentive to keep forest landowners on the land. And that's, of course, one of our primary outcomes. Other things that are going on that influence, there are adaptation groups. Rachel is co-chairing what we call Tag 4 on the adaptation side of the business, and we're trying to make sure that all these things link together at some point. Some of the common interests, as we said, the interests in the forest sector work group are all interested in reducing greenhouse gases. They understand the importance of having healthy and working forests in this state, and they want it to be a comprehensive system that keep forest landowners in forestry and maintain our forest land base. We want to be able to bring high quality carbon credits to the market. And as I said before, we don't want any unintended consequences as a result of something we suggest. The membership of this group is a very careful balance between forest landowner interests, both large and small, environmental interests, including land trusts, such as EcoTrust, and we've also, in the 2008 climate group, we had potential buyers of these credits, which helped us ground us sort of in reality on what would make them want to buy one of these credits versus not to. And then in both cases, we are interacting with local government because particularly in the avoided conversion situation, we need to figure out how to partner up with local government in order to deal with that issue.
Steve?
Yes.
There's no federal nexus
No.
right now.
Not right now. I sort of mixed and matched priorities between 2 years ago and the present group, but avoided conversion, as Craig has said, is a high priority for both the groups. I'll talk a little bit about forest management and harvested wood products. Reforestation is something that we addressed in 2008, and recognizing that some of these things where we want to work on protocols, what we don't want to do is reinvent the wheel. So for example, 2 years ago, we looked at reforestation, and California had a model already out there. So the question is, do we need to just tweak it for use up here once we have a market in place? Substitution for biofuels, meaning is there an opportunity to use wood or biomass to produce fuels instead of to offset petroleum-based fuels, and figuring out how to deal with fire and forest health in the emissions context as Craig suggested. Same thing for wood, for fuel-intensive products. What we're talking about there is wood, what I call wood is good. So you may have a building that's very energy efficient, but if it's all built out of concrete and steel, there's a lot of greenhouse emissions that took place to produce that steel and concrete. So is there ways in appropriate circumstances where we can use wood instead of concrete and steel to offset some of our fuel-intensive products? Ecosystem services, at one of his slides, talked about the whole notion of byproducts from this climate process, and certainly understanding how if we do one incentive, if there are also other positive things that come out of that would be good. And then reviewing existing protocols is sort of where we're focused this year. I won't repeat what Craig said about what offset requirements are, but let me talk about avoided conversion, and this is the result of the 2008 work group, and now we're digging into this to see if it's what we need to change in order to make it more successful. The goals remain the same: to maximize keeping working lands working, the need to minimize the loss of carbon storage where conversion is likely to occur, deal with leakage, and integrate our discussions with other land use issues. So we had basically two ideas on this. And let me go to the next one first. One was the whole notion of transfer of development rights. And so if you have a piece of forest land and you want to avoid converting that piece of forest land, one way to do that is to purchase or transfer the development rights on that parcel into, say, an urban growth area and densify that urban growth area instead of continuing to bleed out into the rural and potentially into the long-term forestry areas. This accomplishes or helps keep working forest lands in place while making sure that we can still accommodate growth where we intended it to be under growth management. Now, going back to cluster development, that is the notion of taking a parcel, and let's say you're in Thurston County, and you got this interesting 1 in 5 rural what do you call it, zoning. And instead of dividing up that parcel, a 40-acre parcel, say, into 8 5s, and clear cutting each one, and basically you end up with 5-acre, lots and so forth, with no room for working forest to continue to exist. Or, you end up with these patchwork where even if forest landowners around some of these 40-acre parcels still want to practice, it becomes harder and harder. Even though we have a right to forestry law, neighbors don't want to hear the skidder start at 2 o'clock in the morning, things like that. So the idea is if you can't prevent conversion, then at least do it smarter. Have a smaller footprint. So cluster development was one of the ideas that came out of our so you take that 40 acres and you put all the development in just 10 of those 40 acres. You put and maybe get some bonus housing. So maybe you get 10 units instead of 8 on that 10 acres. And then the rest of it has a conservation easement on it so that working forest lands can be conserved. So that's the thought that was put out there 2 years ago, and we're trying to refine that now. So what I want to talk to you about a little bit is about forest management. And you probably can't see this very well, but this is basically the carbon cycle in the forest environment. And what you probably can see are these big green wedges, and right above the wedges are these pink areas. And those represent probably our best opportunity to sequester more carbon in the forest. And the green areas are the trees themselves. So if you have a longer rotation, you're sequestering more wood on the landscape than you would be presently. In the case of the pink stuff, that's long-lived wood products. And that's short-term wood products is like the paper on, I was going to point to the easel, there's no paper on the easel. This is short-lived wood products, they go bye-bye fairly quickly, and so it's not, doesn't have a lot of value in sequestering. But if we make more doors, tables, buildings out of wood, then we can increase the sequestration over time for long-lived wood products. So that's the basis of where we were going. So the idea was, can we develop a credit system or a potential offset by encouraging forest landowners that want to have longer rotations? And then their business as usual, whatever they would do beyond their business as usual practices have the potential of being sold as a credit. And the same thing for if you could calculate how much wood product a landowner puts out, and there are ways to do this, believe it or not. They're not easy ways, but you can calculate how many wood products comes off of out of landowners. And the idea is if you increase the long-lived wood products over the short-lived, then you can sequester carbon as products over the longer term. So those are the two concepts that we had there. And I'm going to, as I said, reforestation, we aren't focusing a lot of time on that this time around because there's already protocols out there. And reforestation in this context is not so much about reforesting on a managed forest. This is about really afforestation. So increasing the amount of wood in a city through parks, reforesting parks and so forth is more what this is about than the fact that we've had reforestation laws on the books here since '47. That really doesn't gain us a whole lot. But if you had former forest lands for whatever reasons, we had an opportunity to reforest them, that could qualify. Other ideas, as I said before, talking about looking at the full life cycle of carbon in the forest, including buildings. How do we increase the notion of buildings that sequester more carbon than, say, a concrete and steel building like this is, even though there's wood in it. It's primarily built out of concrete and steel. The notion of how you capture ecosystem services as a byproduct of carbon offsets, and the fact that we're going to have data needs ongoing to track this once a market emerges is going to be an important piece here. So our current group is divided into 3 subgroups. One is about incentives. How do we provide incentives for people to stay on the land and sequester more carbon? 2, how do we continue to march forward on the whole avoided conversion issue? It's not just because of carbon, but it's because we want to keep that working forest land base out there anyway. And then 3rd, start reviewing the other protocols that exist around the country to see if there's some opportunities to use those or tweak them so that Washington forest landowners can take advantage of them as the carbon develops here, or the market develops here, excuse me. We need to provide recommendations to my director and the governor by December, and then part of this work will also infuse into the incentives group that will have to be done starting this coming winter, that DNR will be leading. So I think that's it for me. Any questions before I run off?
Where's the balance point between this steel stuff and the wood stuff and actually offsetting the carbon? Is that really possible?
We're just suggesting that's one way, one kind of thing you can do to help sequester more carbon. We're not suggesting, for example, you replace a 6-story place like this with wood, because that's probably not appropriate. But certainly single or 2-story buildings made out of wood. I mean, if people really want to get into green building, you need to look at the life cycle of the products you're putting into that building, not just whether it's energy efficient. That's the point. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you see Washington State developing their own protocols, or do you see Washington State, as an example, CARS protocols and avoided conversion? I've got teensy bit of experience there and found that they were the working forest. You might as well not think about it as being a working forest. It would really simply be the trees growing forever. So are we going to develop our own protocols that would be recognized nationally for that market?
That's a really good question. The CAR protocol, just for everybody, is the California
It's now the Climate Action.
Climate Action Reserve. Thank you. Started as a part of the California Air Resources Board, but it's now a separate nonprofit entity that is trying to develop, it is developing protocols that hopefully will be recognized nationwide over time, but it's focused on how California does forest business. And so there are issues with that protocol for Washington forest landowners, and what we're looking very closely at right now is, are there ways, and would the CAR board be approachable in tweaking it so that it could be a protocol that Washington forest landowners would take advantage of. There are other protocols out there. We really don't want to reinvent the wheel if we can find protocols that can be made to work here. But one of the challenging thing right now is we don't have a regulatory cap in order to really energize the market. And so that's also people not sure how much energy they want to put into the developing protocols without a clear picture on what's going to happen as far as a regulatory cap, because the Senate has dropped the ball right now on any federal climate legislation. The question then comes to exactly what you're asking. Is Washington going to do something independently, similar to what California has done, but they're wondering whether they don't like being in the position they're in, or are we going to all put our eggs in the WCI basket, the Western Climate Initiative basket, so which is a regional opportunity.
I'll try and get through mine. A lot of what some of the slides that I have already been covered, so I'll go pretty fast. And my talk is, I was charged by Craig to talk about the market perspective, and what we found in creating our own protocol, which is Northwest neutral, is that what we wanted in support of our small forest landowners was to get the highest value for the kinds of encumbrances that are real to a landowner's bottom line. And so we weren't really interested in the low end of the market. And so the question is, how do you create a protocol that attracts the high end of the market? And for us, it's the voluntary market here in the U.S., here in Washington, and to some degree, here in the Puget Sound. Okay? So that's my angle, the view box that I put through it. Whether you agree with that or not and feel like it excludes people, not really my concern, to be honest, because I need that high market. I'm not really interested in 7 cents a metric ton that is being sold at CCX. I'm like, why bother? I could make more selling firewood for small landowners. I'm not even going to bother with it. So that's kind of my perspective, and we can talk about kind of how the market's going and where it's going, and that's the fun part of the talk, because it's the Wild West out there. This is a little bit about who I am for those of you who don't know who I am, and who we are. We've been around for a little while, and our primary program is a Forest Stewardship Council certification program for small forest landowners. And out of a recognition about 3 or 4 years ago, the kinds of obligations that voluntarily our landowners were participating in, things like verification, longer rotations, higher retention, there seemed to be a kind of a cool fit with this whole ecosystem service thing. And I went, hey, is there an opportunity to reward our landowners for the good work they're doing with regards to climate? And then got interested in what the opportunities were. What the opportunities were for increased revenue or rewarding that kind of commitment that they were making in a much more permanent way than FSC can offer. And what I want you to kind of get away with today, or take away today, is to gain an understanding of the markets as they are currently. Learn what's important about a quality offset versus what is considered a non-quality offset. And if we are we can argue about whether we chose the correct terms. We can also talk about higher levels of encumbrance and lower levels of encumbrance, if that's more palatable. Understand how forest carbon offsets can support conservation, and learn about Northwest Neutral and our offset program, and gain an understanding of our crazy experience, which I think is the most interesting thing for this crowd, about, hey, I do this kind of crazy stuff, creating a protocol, and then actually trying to sell the stuff, which is even more interesting. A little bit of an outline. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about the market than Craig did, but regulatory, voluntary types of offsets was covered a little bit, and then Northwest Neutral and developing a protocol and a program. The regulatory market, this is really, I want you to take home, it's for real. I mean, that's a market, right? That's an industry. $94 billion exchanged in 2009, and here in the voluntary market, we got 387 million. It's not just trading chickens with your neighbor. So one of the most well-known markets is the Chicago Climate Exchange. It is a big basket of all kinds of exchanges. Forestry is a part of that. It tends to be considered the kind of the catch-all, the Kool-Aid, the generic. It doesn't trade for that much money. It is, I think it's been down as low as what, 3 cents a market. Yeah, it's really, and right now the market, we can just say, is really depressed. There's a lot of uncertainty in the carbon market in the United States. There is a lot of uncertainty because we were thinking, oh, we're going to have to trade this, this year. Nah, skip that. We're not having one this year. No legislation is going to come through. And the car, which people brought up, is kind of is the high end of the market, right? And the assumption was that they are a precursor to federal legislation, and what kind of everybody's tracking. And they're also paying the highest because they have the highest regulatory encumbrances associated with participating, and particularly in forestry. And so people are watching that high-end market and trying to generate projects that would fit into that market. There's a lot of speculation that was really driving CAR, as we call it, just to not have to say the whole thing all the time, CAR, as we call it, driving that assumption that this would be the market that really people would be looking to for not only a regional position, but also a national position. And because the California Air Resources Board decided to have an argument with the legislature and some other folks in the community, there would create an enormous amount of uncertainty, and their price from, say, $11 a metric ton dropped to $5 and $7 a metric ton, and then all the brokers out there and the speculators went, whoa, and that became very uninteresting from a landowner's perspective. That's still too low, right? So that's kind of, we talked about jumping around, but then there's this kind of the over-the-counter market. There is still a market out there that sells directly from buyers to sellers. No middleman. I'm a business owner who's going to make a contract arrangement directly with a landowner or directly with somebody who's got wind power or solar panels, and we're going to make a direct contribution to that development so that I can declare that I am carbon neutral. That still happens. That's that's the most fundamental exchange in a market for offsets. That there's no outside third-party verification associated with it, and those are still happening out there. And they make estimates about how those are done, or how many of them are done. But an important notion still to understand that it ranges from that kind of exchange to the EU, right? Emerging standards. The newest one of the bunch is the American Carbon Registry, which is now being considered the most forest-friendly of the bunch from a protocol emerging standards position. And potentially, there's a group called, if you're really into this stuff, you want to go geek out, there's a group called WinRock, who has been involved in the forest carbon development for protocols and measuring and monitoring of those kinds of things, and they have endorsed this and have been a big part of developing these standards for forestry. So that's it's got some positive reputation, as well as it potentially is more rigorous than Chicago. So it's kind of like it's being seen as the alternative to CAR, kind of in the market, right? Because CAR is seen as too strict for some folks. This was talked about. This is our east side of the country neighbors have developed their own system as RGGI, and then there's the Western Climate Initiative that has become a regional force. And with CAR kind of prices dropping, and there's some uncertainty about the governmental structure of what's going to happen with CAR, a lot of attention now is being focused on the Western Climate Initiative. All of a sudden, we thought they were dead 2 years ago. But now, oh, they're the guy in town. So who knows with this crazy market. Offset types was already covered. Just real quick, I'm going to talk, we spent considerable energy looking into avoided conversion as an organization, but have really landed on forest management as the thing we sell, forest management credits, or offsets, I should say. Again, we went for the high price market. We are currently selling CO2 offsets, forest offsets at $20 a metric ton. And you should all be surprised, just to let you know. Because that, especially in this market, is huge. And depending on who you talk to, some forestry folks would say, involved in this market, still that's not enough to actually compete with the board footage prices people can get and the kind of encumbrances that are put on land. But at $20 a metric ton or even $15 a metric ton, our landowners are still interested in making those kinds of commitments to climate change. So that's what we're working at.
What's that average metric ton per acre?
It depends on protocol. That's a really hard question to answer. It depends on who's doing the judging, how much the leakage issues are. Just an example, you can have, on our website, you knew that was coming. On our website, there is a comparison between Northwest Neutral, what's called the Voluntary Carbon Standard, was an international standard for carbon, and then the CAR protocols. And we compared, based on those carbon elements, we compared our situation to theirs for protocol. And things like leakage can be anywhere from, if you figure out somebody's additionality, or the kind of, if it's exceeding state regulations or those kinds of things, you've actually taken a biomass inventory to figure all that out, and then they can take away up to 30 to 40%, saying, well, you've got severe leakage issues, there's too much risk of leakage, and a lot of your additionality goes away, which affects the actual tonnage you can sell in the market. So it's a huge
Leakage is like emissions from soil.
Leakage can be anything from the assumption that if I'm sequestering more carbon and retaining more biomass on the ground in my property, I'm reducing the amount, I'm pushing the demand for wood to a nearby property. It can be that kind of leakage. It can be things like a landowner having property that this property is involved in the carbon market, but this other property over here is, I've got some ag land over here that is actually emitting soils because I'm churning it up every year, or I'm converting it into something else. So even an individual landowner can be a leakage all by itself in some broad spectrum.
Who do you buy it?
Some of that's confidential. Thank you very much. That's a fair question. I can't do this without having fun. Sorry. It's boring otherwise. The reason that our buyers tend to be people who are obviously conservation minded, who want to make a claim towards neutrality, their footprint, who are involved in and who want the market recognition for that. People who are involved in either green building and or who are either even nonprofits who have a travel emission that they just can't seem to reduce. So it's that wide range. One that was highly publicized was Shorebank Enterprise Cascadia, which is now Enterprise Cascadia, as well as EcoHouse, which is a environmental building company in Seattle. Bought some offsets from us that was publicized. So, okay. Talked about that. And I'm watching the clock. Again, what we were after was it's really hard to participate in this market if you're not a big landowner. In all the big protocols and markets that we've talked about thus far, if you talk to somebody who's doing this kind of to make money as a broker, wants to be a broker of carbon into one of these systems, they say, I ain't touching anything less than 10,000 acres. I'm like, well, that's a whole lot of landowners who don't get to play, right? And in the CAR protocol, currently it's not financially feasible to actually participate unless you got something like 3,000 acres, is some of the analysis that the financial analysis has been done. I'm like, well, that leaves more people, or some more people left out, right? We're dropping it only down to here. And so we deal, our members are, anywhere from, we have, some larger landowners at 14,000 acres, but a lot of our landowners are 20, 40, 80, 300. And I'm like, 300 acres, that's worth saving. I like 300 acres in forestry. So that's one of the reasons it was obvious a natural fit for us because that's where our clientele is, but we also understood if we didn't create a market for them at this high end in the region, who would, right? We had a natural fit. We wanted to recognize folks who had made the commitment to FSC certification, who were doing those kinds of things. But one of the important things that you should know is FSC is not binding. You can have a 5-year contract under an FSC agreement, certification system, that, by mutual agreement can end. It's not tied to the land. It doesn't go with the ownership. It's not like a conservation easement. That is a voluntary system that is completely voluntary from certifier to the landowner. And so it has no kind of teeth the way that a carbon market is asking for. And so there needs to be encumbrances. But we thought that there was an importance. People were making this commitment, generousness. We're making the commitment over time, or at least for their lifetime. They'd like to see that continue, that style of forest management continue on their land. That supports biodiversity. We didn't want any unintended consequences in that direction, because you can grow carbon in forests like corn, just old corn, right? And you can say, who cares about the habitat and all the soils and that kind of stuff? We were just storing carbon. So we had to care about that. And it promotes forest health. Those things we cared about. In that context, we were very similar to the CAR methodology, our protocols. These were already touched on, the kind of things that you have to look for in an offset. Baseline, there's this concept of better than business as usual, right? So in order to figure out what is additional, what is more that is already expected of us based on state law, based on current forest practices that are financially reasonable, that are reasonable, we had to figure out where our baseline would be for small forest landowners. And we were doing this back in the day when CAR was around, but there were few options out there for protocols. I mean, you think about how new the carbon market is. I mean, this is not that old. It's amazing. South America, they've been doing this, and Europe has been doing this a lot, but for the United States, it's a much different deal. So we were interested in not only exceeding and we thought we could attract more dollars for this, not only exceeding state forest practices, but also industry standards. So there was this idea that we were going to be better than not only legal business as usual, but practice business as usual. Okay? And additionality comes from that idea. A little diagram, something that was already talked about. Higher levels of retention, growing older trees. These are issues of leakage. We have a 20% set aside, which is kind of industry standard in many ways. But they range dramatically from standard to standard about what insurance and risk and leakage are associated with any offset. And it may vary. In some of them, there's a chart. You know, you figure out your leakage. Permanence. This is a big debate. This is where we're having all our fun at the committee level with industry and the environs. 100 years. We modeled ourselves over the CAR protocol. We will also work with a local land trust. One of the important things is I was a land trust board member. I didn't want to become or circumvent what the land trusts were doing. And so if somebody would like to tie their carbon commitment to a permanent conservation easement that goes past 100 years, then we would work with a local land trust to combine those legal documents and make that happen. But we believed we could get higher prices and realistic prices if we pushed for the longer rotation. I mean, the longer contract. And that was important. It being legal and binding to the property, and it encumbers past the current ownership. Measurement and monitoring. Something we knew a lot about in FSC, because we do measurement, monitoring, audits, verification, that kind of stuff. And if you dig deep enough, you can find an argument about who has the best scientific-based methodologies for measuring and monitoring and calculating carbon. And some of it is done by assumptions based on measurements, what's called a biomass inventory. But there is some real consensus. But if at the high end of the geek level, you can find some debate, but there is consistency among most people who work in the forest industry that you can get really good results and some real satisfaction and some sense of guarantee about what actual biomass exists on a piece of ground. Verification. One of the things that's important is that you go out and monitor and make sure that carbon still exists that you purchased, right? It's still there. It's not gone. And the CAR requires that you go every 6 years that somebody physically hits the ground from a third-party verification standpoint. Ours is every 5. Okay, here's really quickly. These are some of the things I started to sit down, and when Craig asked me to talk about our experience, I sit down and wrote down all the things. If somebody wanted to start a carbon offset program today, one, I wouldn't encourage it. Two, I would say, here's the list of things you got to think about, all the way from developing the protocols and having enough money and technical experience at your disposal to do that, to actually selling that stuff on the market currently. One of the things that we did was we started out thinking we were going to sell into the brokerage market, right? I could sell more volumes of carbon faster and support more landowners' commitment if I could get into the brokerage market. Because, they're walking around with $1 million checkbooks, right? It take care of a lot of people real quick. But when the bottom dropped out of the market, I went, nah, I guess I'm premature to some degree here. And we decided to go to the direct market, which required then a marketing effort, right? You have to have things to show people. Then we were going directly to businesses, and that created another level of expertise that had to be brought on board from outside our organization. Because I know you're not surprised, I'm not much of a marketer. And this is on our website, you can find this comparison between VCS, CAR, and Northwest Neutral. And I'm talking as fast as I can. We talked a little bit about this. The current market, these are some of the issues that we ran up against in not currently participating in some of the current markets. And the biggest one is the expense associated with participating in some of the current for our landowners. Just that whole 3,000 acres is basically, it doesn't make sense to maintain your participation for 100 years financially, just run the numbers, and annual audits and regular fees over time for 100 years, if you don't have enough carbon to make that worthwhile, and you're not growing a lot more carbon in the future, right? And a lot of our landowners have a lot to sell up front because they have older, larger trees, but they're not necessarily growing a lot more carbon, and they just don't have enough pool to pay those ongoing fees over time, and that's a real bugaboo. And they're trying, CAR is attempting to develop an aggregation model that I think is being reviewed today and being adopted, but it still doesn't, they say some folks can get it down to 1,000 acres and it's financially feasible over a 100-year period, but we haven't found that. So, national cap and trade, we talked about already that there is, it's maybe, hopefully, we get a cap and trade system in 11 or legislation for that in 11 or 12. CAR aggregation, brokers are currently paying at CAR prices, which are between $5 and $7 a metric ton. I haven't looked lately, it could be lower. Direct marketing is where we decided to go, and we've had some success. This is our website, Northwestern Neutral, for the organization. And that is my chat. Sorry, I'm 10 minutes over.
Thank you. So I want to open the floor to some questions. If you two are willing to stay for a little bit, you're welcome to sit down. You can stand here for a while. And I can sneak over here so I can get a good look at everyone. Are there any points of discussion or questions?
I'd like to answer the national question that was postponed. Okay?
Yeah.
I think the reason that, from a seller standpoint, the reason we would like a national cap and trade and we would like both the federal government to make the rules is because imagine the market that, we're pretty good-sized polluters as a nation. We rank pretty high in that emissions category. And if the national government puts on a cap and trade, the demand for, initially in the early years particularly, for offsets and the prices then paid because of that demand will be fairly high. So from a purely economic standpoint, you want to just be clear about it, that would be a good thing. And I understand that the standards might be higher, but the prices will definitely be higher because there will just be more demand. Because those industries will have to offset in the initial years as they ramp up. And that was something you alluded to earlier was our, blanking on his name, Mr. Ecology, Steve, thank you. Steve alluded to with the national standard is that we would have where we play in this game. But the important thing is that we are hopefully able to participate at all. And so if the standard is not, if the forestry standard is seen as not rigorous enough, it doesn't, as my illustrious colleague Kirk Hansen says, it doesn't pass the silly grin test, then the idea is that forestry offsets won't be considered desirable by the market. And so in some really dramatic way, while framed by legislation, there is this component of a market demand, right? And the market speaking to what it will pay for. Hopefully that was helpful.
I have a question. Does the current, does the cap and trade in general, because it's so focused on trees as the means of sequestering carbon, does that increase the pressure of conversion on agricultural lands, grasslands, areas that don't have trees, where a lot of the biodiversity is concentrated, is actually being hit harder because of cap and trade, focus on trees during the soil?
No, that's good. That's a good question. So you're thinking, well, right now, none of the efforts, none of the protocols or talks about packaging up offsets would allow non-forest land to be forested to produce carbon for marketing. The only reforestation is lands that were once forested and could support forests. So reforesting those kind of lands is generally considered an acceptable way to produce tons of carbon to sell. Trying to put forests where shrub steppe is now or something like that would not be considered an acceptable way.
It's more that by what's being sequestered, that land over there is going to keep the carbon.
Yes.
All for us. We're not going to build a city there, shopping malls, whatever. Where we're going to build them is over on agricultural land.
Oh, so that would be a question of leakage. So if you're going to say, this forest land is zoned to be cut down and converted to shopping centers, okay? But I'm the owner of that, and instead of doing that, I'm going to keep it working forest lands, that avoided loss of carbon storage, I'm going to package up and sell into the carbon market. But no, the carbon market then says, whoa, there's a leakage consideration because the development market is still demanding development. And if I can't develop it here, I'm going to develop it over here. And if you could demonstrate, if it was fairly obvious that by not developing here, you're going to push development, particularly over onto some even more environmentally sensitive lands, then I think that leakage would undercut the claim of carbon additionality. So I think it's a good question. It's this leakage, if it sounds obscure and hard to figure out to you that aren't dealing with this every day, it's obscure and hard to figure out to those who are dealing with it every day. So I'm not going to try to make it simple for you, but that's a valid concern.
And some of the arguments that complicate it even more is the implicit assumption that you would be pushing pressure somewhere else, as if the universe is basically in a constant flow of and not affected by other forces in a market.
Yeah.
Some of the other things that affect market on wood products being harvested, I think it's the price of them currently and or the real estate market. And so this is implicit assumption that they would be developed is also one of the arguments being played back and forth. What are the modeling exercises that determine the supposed leakage issue? And so that's another complicating factor.
And markets are really dynamic, and all these other markets are actually more powerful than the carbon market right now. And they're going to, like we talked about, currently working on avoided conversion. What we're trying to do with the work group now is figure out how the carbon aspects of these land use changes can have any role at all in land use decisions. You know, they're not driving the show, but they're maybe going to be influential.
I guess my question was along those lines too, is longer rotation, more retention sounds like it means less wood being harvested. Well, our consumers are still going to demand wood, so is that going to come from Brazil?
Yeah, so that has to be figured in. Has to be figured in.
And that's where some of those, 40 and 60% assume from a carbon's perspective, are we just sequestering over here, but because of market dynamic, we're pushing the emission over there. And that has a lot to do with the assumption that there's a constant demand and a consistent demand for wood. And currently we're not seeing that. And there's also this idea that people will still use wood in some fashion in the marketplace. And so how you balance that, and they're not really concerned about the monetary issue, but the associated emission of that leakage, right? And so they're calculating the assumption and creating these buffers and reducing the, quote, value of the emission with this leakage percentage thing, right? That risk of leakage. And so they're saying, well, you think you've got 300 metric tons, but really, because of the leakage issue, you only get, 100, if it's really dramatic.
The way I see the carbon market going is it's not probably going to drive different types of forest business models into doing things way outside their business model. So landowners that are practicing a certain type of forestry that emphasizes the volume in the forest are going to try to find some additionality within that basic business model. And it'll probably be in forest carbon storage, some increment. People that are in the business of turning out a high volume of wood products are probably not going to come over here and try to be in this model in order to sell more carbon. They're going to try to find additionality within their own business model. So that might be, if at the end of 100 years you can calculate that you would have had this much wood products still out there being stored, and you can say, as a result of some action I've taken, I can increase that by 5% at the end of 100 years. I can package that up and sell it. I'm still in the same timber business here. I haven't changed my business model for the sake of carbon. I've just tried to have carbon enhance my business model. I think that's what we're seeing. I think maybe at the margin, people might change their business model a little bit, but people who are in conservation forestry are going to stay in conservation forestry. People who are in industrial forestry are going to stay in industrial forestry. There's additionality to be found to the benefit of the atmosphere in both of those models.
One more question, and then we can do some informal.
Is natural disaster fire incorporated in leakage? The level risk?
No, it's incorporated otherwise.
Risk.
Yeah, risk.
Yeah. So, and they call them insurance pools or buffer pools, and that's usually an additional percentage taken out of the additionality equation in a sense, or the valuable or sellable biomass that you have is basically taken out of there, and that is, it depending on the protocol, it's a different percentage wherever you go.
It's pooled with other sellers. So you, just like insurance, so you pool a certain percentage, everyone does, so that if a particular seller's sold tons of carbon go up in greenhouse gas emissions, the pool compensates the buyer.
To make it credible.
Yeah.
Right.
So if I, within 3 years, my forest burns and you come to audit and there is no forest,
And it's not your fault,
then
I have a pool, I have a
You still
buffer.
pay me.
No, I don't still pay you. You've been paid
You
for
already
what
got paid.
you already got paid. But what I do for my buyer, which is the person you're concerned about right now, is that I replace those tons, because you didn't get paid for those. You were required to sequester maintain that certain biomass on the ground, but you were then, and so is everybody else in the group. From that pool, I then basically.
You take tons out of the pool.
Right, take tons out of the pool. I was looking for a word, but it means you take tons out of the pool to make that credible, that sale to the buyer credible. Otherwise, the integrity of the whole system kind of falls apart. You have to be able to replace that. So that's an important component of any offset program.
One of the take-homes I hope you will get here is that the whole dynamic here varies depending on where you stand. So if you stand in the perspective of the atmosphere, you're going to mainly be concerned about less tons of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, whether that is coming from reduced emissions or more tons stored in forests or wood products or whatever, and you're not necessarily going to care about any other goals. Okay? If you stand in as a forest landowner, then you're going to care about, okay, how can I get money to maintain whatever my business goals are, and society might share that goal if it's to keep working forest lands in forestry. That might be a socially shared goal, but you're going to want the system to work so that I get paid. If you stand from the concept of we want to promote certain conservation and biodiversity values from forests, then you're going to hope that this carbon market works in a way that supports that goal. And so different folks that are in this same big circle, but kind of standing in different places, will look at the pros and cons of all of this complex dynamics that we've been talking about differently. And thus we have the conversations about, okay, how really will it work in detail, that folks like Denise and Stephen, and to some degree me, get involved in, and it's what makes that job juicy. But it really does depend on where, obviously where you stand depends on where you stand.
And I feel fortunate because my position is to try and, from all those perspectives, try and meet all those goals at some level.
Yeah, they don't have to be exclusive.
It doesn't have to be exclusive. No.
But it is juicier when you have some people who are strong in one camp or the other.
And some people's perspective is within the institutional structure of the marketplace. How can we create a market institution that actually works when the product is so abstract? And so they want to make sure that there is credibility and fluidity in that system without driving the transaction costs through the roof so that nobody can afford to participate.
And ironically, the folks who kind of get the bad name in this position are the brokers, because they're just those middlemen making all the profits.
Couldn't do it without them.
Couldn't do it without them, and they're most concerned about the credibility of the market and its integrity, because they want to make money over time. They're not like the one-off kind of a landowner's position where I'm going to sell my carbon and I get my money and care about the rest of y'all. But these guys actually, we're in a fortunate position that they're on the side of high-minded integrity because they want to make money over time. Otherwise, without integrity, the market won't exist. So it's a jungle.